Welcome. We now have this new routine where graduate students will be introducing the talent. But I just wanted to say welcome to you all and to remind you that if you want information about future Writer Speak events, you should like us on our Facebook page, Writer Speak Wednesday, or follow us on Twitter at Writer Speak Wednesday. The deadline for submissions for the next issue of TSR is November 21st. Is there anything else? Nope, we're good. So I'm going to introduce, what? Oh, yes. Tomorrow night, Maggie Bloomfield will be presenting her provost lecture at main campus. At what time? At 4 o'clock in the Wang Center. No.
It's not in the humanities.
In the humanities building. And there's a van leaving from here, and if you want information about that, check with Holly Weinberg. So now I'm going to introduce Joe Labriola.
Thank you. Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here tonight. Tonight we welcome someone who is really a renaissance man in the world of literature and a genius at making science accessible, entertaining, and enlightening for millions of readers worldwide. Since graduating from Harvard College, James Gleick has worked as an editor and reporter for the New York Times. He has helped to found a newspaper, The Metropolis, and he's written over half a dozen books to much acclaim by critics and fans alike. His first book, Chaos, was a National Book Award and Pulitzer Prize finalist, as well as a national bestseller. James also wrote the best-selling biographies Genius, The Life and Science of Richard Feynman, and Isaac Newton. His newest book, The Information, A History, A Theory of Flood, was published last year and was on the New York Times bestseller list. James Gleick doesn't just understand how science and technology is changing our lives and the world around us, but his ability to craft these topics to connect with millions of readers worldwide is really a testament to his continued success. Also joining us tonight is Daniel Menaker, who will be interviewing James Gleick. Daniel is a guest interviewer for our Writer Speak series, and we're happy to welcome him back here tonight. Daniel was an editor at The New Yorker, Random House, and HarperCollins, and he has published 2 books of short stories as well as taught graduate writing courses at the City University of New York and UCLA. So with that said, please give a warm welcome to our guests tonight, James Gleick and Daniel Menaker.
Jim's going to read for 10, 15 minutes, and then I'll join him.
Hi.
Hi.
Well, okay, I'm going to sit down and read. Joe, thank you for that extremely kind introduction. Maybe too kind. We'll see. This is a book. I want to read from the prologue, but not from the very beginning of the book, even though that would be the only part that I could read without some introduction, because that would just be the beginning. But so I have to say that for a few pages before this, I talk a little bit about Claude Shannon, mathematician and engineer at Bell Labs in 1948, and the birth of information theory, and the beginning of the idea that information was something that scientists could and should treat mathematically as their business, as opposed to just a vague and fuzzy word in the world. And so the part I'm going to read is then what follows the rest of kind of the, I guess I think of my prologue as sort of an overture. Then, when it was made simple, distilled, counted in bits, information was found to be everywhere. Shannon's theory made a bridge between information and uncertainty, between information and entropy, between information and chaos. It led to compact disks and fax machines, computers and cyberspace, Moore's law, and all the world's Silicon alleys. Information processing was born, along with information storage and information retrieval. people began to name a successor to the Iron Age and the Steam Age. Man, the food gatherer, reappears incongruously as information gatherer, remarked Marshall McLuhan in 1967. He wrote this an instant too soon, in the first dawn of computation and cyberspace. We can see now that information is what our world runs on, the blood and the fuel, the vital principle. It pervades the sciences from top to bottom, transforming every branch of knowledge. Information theory began as a bridge from mathematics to electrical engineering, and from there to computing. Now even biology has become an information science, a subject of messages, instructions, and code. Genes encapsulate information and enable procedures for reading it in and writing it out. Life spreads by networking. The body itself is an information processor. Memory resides not just in brains, but in every cell. No wonder genetics bloomed, along with information theory. DNA is the quintessential information molecule, the most advanced message processor at the cellular level, an alphabet and a code, 6 billion bits to form a human being. What lies at the heart of every living thing is not a fire, not a warm breath, not a spark of life, declares the evolutionary theorist Richard Dawkins. It is information, words, instructions. If you want to understand life, don't think about vibrant, throbbing gels and oozes. Think about information technology. The cells of an organism are nodes in a richly interwoven communications network, transmitting and receiving, coding and decoding. Evolution itself embodies an ongoing exchange of information between organism and environment. The gene has its cultural analog, too, the meme. In cultural evolution, a meme is a replicator and a propagator, an idea, a fashion, a chain letter, or a conspiracy theory. On a bad day, a meme is a virus. Economics is recognizing itself as an information science, now that money itself is completing a developmental arc from matter to bits, stored in computer memory and magnetic strips, world finance coursing through the global nervous system. Even when money seemed to be material treasure, heavy in pockets and ships' holds and bank vaults, it always was information. Coins and notes, shekels and cowries were all just short-lived technologies for tokenizing information about who owns what. And atoms? Matter has its own coinage. And physics, too, finds itself sideswiped by a new intellectual model. Increasingly, the physicists and the information theorists are one and the same. The bit is a fundamental particle of a new sort, not just tiny, but abstract, a binary digit, a flip-flop, a yes or no. It is insubstantial. Yet as scientists finally come to understand information, they wonder whether it may be primary, more fundamental than matter itself. They suggest that the bit is the irreducible kernel, and that information forms the very core of existence. Bridging the physics of the 20th and 21st centuries, John Archibald Wheeler, the last surviving collaborator of both Einstein and Bohr, puts this manifesto in oracular monosyllables: it from bit. What we call reality, Wheeler wrote coyly, arises in the last analysis from the posing of yes-no questions. He added, all things are information theoretic in origin, and this is a participatory universe. As the role of information grows, beyond anyone's reckoning, it grows to be too much. TMI, people now say. We have information fatigue, anxiety, and glut. We have met the devil of information overload and his impish underlings, the computer virus, the busy signal, the dead link, and the PowerPoint presentation. All this, too, is due in its roundabout way to Shannon. Everything changed so quickly. John Robinson Pierce, a Bell Labs engineer, mused afterward, "It is hard to picture the world before Shannon as it seemed to those who lived in it. It's difficult to recover innocence, ignorance, and lack of understanding. Yet the past does come back into focus. In the beginning was the Word, according to John. We are the species that named itself Homo sapiens, the one who knows, and then after reflection amended that to Homo sapiens sapiens. The greatest gift of Prometheus to humanity was not fire, after all. Numbers, too, chiefest of sciences, I invented for them, and the combining of letters, creative mother of the muses' arts, with which to hold all things in memory. The alphabet was a founding technology of information. The telephone, the fax machine, the calculator, and ultimately the computer are only the latest innovations devised for saving, manipulating, and communicating knowledge. Our culture has absorbed a working vocabulary for these useful inventions. We speak of compressing data, aware that this is quite different from compressing a gas. We know about streaming information, parsing it, sorting it, matching it, and filtering it. Our furniture includes iPads and plasma displays. Our skills include texting and Googling. We are endowed. We are expert. So we see information in the foreground. But it has always been there. It pervaded our ancestors' world too, taking forms from solid to ethereal. Granite gravestones and the whispers of courtiers. The punched card, the cash register, the 19th century difference engine, the wires of telegraphy all played their parts in weaving the spider web of information to which we cling. Each new information technology, in its own time, set off blooms in storage and transmission. From the printing press came new species of information organizers, dictionaries, cyclopedias, almanacs, compendiums of words, classifiers of facts, trees of knowledge. Hardly any information technology goes obsolete. Each new one throws its predecessors into relief. Thus, Thomas Hobbes, in the 17th century, resisted his era's new media hype. The invention of printing, though ingenious, compared with the invention of letters, is no great matter. Up to a point, he was right. Every new medium transforms the nature of human thought. In the long run, history is the story of information becoming aware of itself.
I mean, isn't that fucking good? I mean, it's so annoying. I told Jim that that it was the book I've read it a long time ago, and I've been rereading it in preparation for this evening, and it is just, it's just sickening how good it is. Throughout the book, there's a kind of parade of important figures. And I'd like to know, as you wrote it, who stood out the most? Who grabbed your attention? I mean, there's Shannon, there's, I'm going to forget all their names now, Norbert Wiener, it's almost a procession-like book in that respect. And I just wonder, as you researched it and wrote it, who grabbed your attention?
Well, I started with this guy Shannon. I started with Claude Shannon. I don't know. Is that a house familiar name? No, because this is an MFA program. If you were engineering graduate students, I guarantee that every hand in the room would go up. And that's already sort of peculiar. I mean, he should be as famous as Einstein, but he wasn't.
That's what I gathered from the book. I want you to talk about him a little bit, but do
you want me to list other names first instead of going into that?
Yes, list the other names first, then come back to Claude Shannon.
Well, but so now let me just
Who's
say
in the parade?
Okay, well, in the parade, I don't know. People are different sizes in the parade, aren't they?
Well,
I mean, Shannon was, at one point I never thought about writing Shannon's biography, but I thought somebody should. And that hasn't been done. And it would be hard, because he was a little bit, he might not be, his life might not be big enough or something. All right.
he didn't play the.
But
he didn't
anyway,
play the tuba
so then I
in the
tried
parade.
to go back in time and look at people. It wasn't all supposed to be about parade of people.
No, I think it's actually
okay.
about something else, but I
But
do
okay,
feel that there's
all right,
a procession.
There's an early figure is Charles Babbage, the 19th century mathematician in England who had this, who was in his time, that is in Victorian England, 30s, 40s, correct me if I'm getting the dates wrong, was famous, big celebrity in England, briefly, and his fame even reached to the U.S. And when you do the kind of Google searches you can do now, you can find all kinds of great things about people writing about Babbage. But then he vanished from everybody's radar, and as of, let's say, 1920, nobody had heard of Charles Babbage.
What did he do?
What he did was, he had an idea for creating a big machine that he called the difference engine. And for short, we would say it was an early computer, because that would be our analog for it. It was going to be a gigantic calculating machine. When I say gigantic, I mean tons, big as a room. And you can see it recreated now at the Science Museum in London, and it's beautiful to look at. Recreated from his drawings and models and partial creation, but he never finished it. It was a failure. All it was meant to do was print out tables of logarithms and other numbers that you could compute. And the idea was that if you could do that, you would have, well, you'd have cheap books of logarithms. Okay, now, so part of my task was to persuade the reader that that was actually really, really valuable and important. And it was. In the world of 1840, if you could print out cheap books of logarithms, you were a master of the universe. I mean, they needed these things for shipping, for commerce. I mean, and they needed logarithms in turn, because logarithms were a way to compute other kinds of numbers, to do arithmetic. I mean, we take it for granted that arithmetic is easy, because you've all got, every one of you in this room, I bet, has a computer in your pocket that's more powerful than the computer that went to space, that went to the moon in the Apollo programs. But it used to be really hard to do arithmetic, and still it was occasionally very valuable. Okay, so am I rambling? Yes.
Well,
But
no,
the point
you're not, actually.
the point was that in the course of creating this machine, I felt he was cosmically making a link between the abstract world of information and the physical world of machinery, a link that is familiar to us, but was not familiar at the time. And furthermore, he himself, now I introduce another character, Ada Byron, Ada Lovelace, the poet's daughter. You've all heard of Byron. I bet most of you have heard of Ada Byron too.
Show of hands. Ada Byron.
She's become sort of famous in our computer era too, because she's been rediscovered, and she was a generation younger than Babbage and his protege, and also, like Babbage, a mathematical genius. Unlike Babbage, untrained and not professional, because, unlike Babbage, she was a woman. And in England in the 19th century, you couldn't go to university, much less publish papers under your own name if you were a woman. So she was kind of a frustrated mathematical genius. And she is called by many people in a sort of bit of PR the world's first programmer. And it's a bit of PR that I think is entirely justified because she saw more than Babbage did in the possibility of the machine. And the thing that she saw that Babbage didn't see, in a nutshell, was that it wasn't just about numbers. It wasn't just about math. It was about information more generally. She said, if you make these machines, why do they have to just do arithmetic? It could be music they're manipulating. We're sending something from one place to another in the cogs and gears of this machinery. And that thing, she didn't call it information. She didn't call it data. That's what we would call it with hindsight, but that's what she was thinking about. She was saying, if it could be numbers, it could be music.
Come back to Shannon now, because I think actually I read your book in about 4 different ways. One of them is the procession, because it's a history of important figures who have done this thing or that thing. And Shannon did seem to me to be, I mean, you come back to him at the end in a sort of climactic way. And I just don't know about, I mean, I'm not saying he isn't in here, but was he personally interesting, or was he just geeky, or was he, how did he come to be who he was, and what was his background?
I think he might have been personally not that interesting. He might have been too geeky, too much of a loner. And I think the same thing is sort of true of Isaac Newton. Too much of a loner, didn't collaborate with people. Shannon's background, he was born in rural Michigan, very rural, remote Michigan, in 19-something, somebody help me, the 1910s, 1918 maybe. And for sort of prosperous middle-class family, and his mother, apart from his father's being a sort of successful businessman, his mother also was a teacher, and so they were smart. And he went to MIT and became a mathematician. No, became an electrical engineer.
Was he a prodigy?
I think he was kind of a prodigy, but he wasn't. How would you know? Well,
I mean, I think one way of measuring that is what age did he go to MIT?
He was pretty young, but he wasn't super young like Norbert Wiener.
Okay.
He wasn't one of these people who was called a prodigy.
Right.
He just was a smart guy.
Right.
Everybody thought he was smart.
Edward O. Wilson said that people who have huge IQs often don't make the big discoveries because they get bored. It's the people who are like between 120 and 150 who do all the amazing work because they persist.
I'm not sure it's about IQ or even persistence. I think in this case, and of course that was sort of the key question, why Shannon?
Yes.
Why was he placed to do that? And I feel the answer to that question has to do with a crossing of lines. And this was also true of Babbage. I'll go back to Babbage for a second. Babbage did this machine, but he was also interested in all kinds. He was thought of as sort of a crank. I mean, on the one hand, he was a legitimate guy. He was the professor of mathematics at Cambridge University. He had Newton's chair of mathematics. But on the other hand, he didn't really do any mathematics. He didn't do any real mathematics. And he got interested in tree rings. He got interested in code breaking. He actually was a pretty good amateur cryptographer. I mean, there was no professional cryptographer.
Right.
He was interested in, he got obsessed with sending messages by means of taking lanterns and lifting shades, occluding lights. And in retrospect, I think it's completely obvious what all of those things have in common. They all have something to do with information. And we can see that because we're so sophisticated about information now, and we see it as a big, all-encompassing category, but that wasn't true in his era, and so he had these scattershot interests.
Did he put them together?
No, he didn't. Well, except in this project. This project was a kind of information project, but no. Now, Shannon, it's the same thing. Shannon was interested in codes. He read Edgar Allan Poe when he was a kid. He became an electrical engineer. He worked on, of all the things that an electrical engineer could do at MIT in the 1920s, he was drawn to be a graduate assistant on a kind of early computer they had, an electrical analog computer called the something, Vannevar Bush's, I forget. No, or before that. It'll come to me when it's too late. It was a big machine involved. It was, as I say, analog, so there were big metal wheels. It didn't produce numerical answers. It produced sort of graphs. Anyway, he did a graduate thesis on genetics, which he had no training, a doctoral thesis in genetics. He created a sort of symbolic algebra for genetics. Genetics in the 1920s was a very primitive science. Remember, it was before they discovered DNA. He was trying to figure out things about inherited characteristics and how you could create a language to manipulate them that would somehow correspond to what people knew to be true, which wasn't very much, about what if you combined this kind of plant with that kind of plant. Anyway, the story I tell is his combining a kind of game-playing fascination with pure mathematics with practicalities of electrical engineering, which had to do with sending stuff through wires in the telephone era. And then he went to work for Bell Labs, which was exactly the place to combine these things, because Bell Labs had their practical, they needed to make money by sending a lot of something through copper wires, and on the other hand, they had, with some foresight, hired a bunch of pure mathematicians.
Why? That's interesting to me about Bell Labs, because it's still a very going and very important institution, correct?
No.
That's what I thought.
Sorry.
I just want to know if he knew that.
Well, by still, if you mean in our lifetimes, yeah, but if you mean now, this year, no, it's kind of, I think it's sort of dying.
Ah.
There is something still called Bell Labs, but it got broken up when they broke up AT&T.
Ah.
And then part of it went with Lucent, and then that got sold to a French company. But more generally, the problem is that the golden age of American companies spending money on pure research is over. And American companies are now more efficient in connecting the money they spend on research to the bottom line than they used to be. And so there's very little left, in my opinion,
Of just people going and thinking.
of just saying, go off,
Think.
yeah. Which they did with Shannon.
Right.
I mean, I described this in the book. There was a period of years when they just said, okay, we've got this loner roaming the halls, doing something. We don't know exactly what it is. Really, literally. And that was true at Bell Labs, I think, up until 20 or 30 years ago, but it's not true anymore.
Well, in my reading of the book, Shannon does emerge in some ways as a central and pivotal character, and I was hoping that he also was a mountain climber, or or was a master pastry chef. But
Well, you and me both.
but no
I
lie.
mean, I was desperate for that kind of thing, for the fun stuff.
Right.
And he, I could say that he used to be known for riding unicycles up and down the hall at MIT.
Is that true?
And that's true.
Is that what?
And there's some other funny
That's
stuff.
pretty good. No, that's good.
I think I threw that in there somewhere. I
Did
mean,
you?
I was desperate. I was grasping for fun detail, as one does. But there wasn't that much, and that's why I think a real biography would be hard.
Yeah. How about in the procession, Wiener, who seems to me to jump off the page in comparison to Claude Shannon?
That's interesting. Well, so Wiener, Norbert Wiener, I won't ask for a show of hands again.
I think you get a much better show of hands. Norbert Wiener?
Okay,
No? Yeah?
Okay.
No.
He was a prodigy of the kind you asked about at MIT. That is, he was the kind he got written up in the newspaper, 14-year-old goes to MIT. By the time he and Shannon crossed paths, that is around 1948, Wiener was much more famous. He was very famous. In that year, in the same year that Shannon wrote his very obscure papers about information theory, Wiener wrote a big best-selling book called Cybernetics. And
he coined the term.
He coined the term. He thought he was very grandiose and self-promoting, and thought he was inventing a whole new science, and that it was just brilliant and it was going to change the world. And he called it Cybernetics, and it really was a bestseller. And it's
as I recall, it was a surprising bestseller. I mean,
yeah,
people didn't expect it.
Well,
I mean,
any science book is a surprising bestseller, right?
Well, you should know.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's a funny sort of book. It's in a way, it's quite readable. You know, you can all read it, but then parts of it are too mathematical, and it's a little bit of a hodgepodge. It doesn't, in my opinion, really hold together. And I tell the story of their collision because it's sort of a funny story. They knew each other. They reviewed each other's books that year.
Somewhat.
There's a little bit of a. You can tell that they're doing that they're gnashing their teeth and grinding their fists, and there's a little bit of a rivalry and competitiveness. And in the end, I have a point of view, which is that Shannon was profoundly, fundamentally important to the development of, I mean, Shannon's work laid a foundation and was built on, and Wiener's kind of went away, which is funny considering the difference in their relative prominence for a few years. And there were a few years in the early 1950s when all kinds of conferences, symposiums were being organized by Wiener and around Wiener's work, cybernetics conferences, and Shannon was a minor guest at these conferences and presented his work. Wiener was the top dog.
Right.
So there's, kind of interesting historical irony there, but I don't want to give the impression that I don't want to take sides too much, because Wiener also was, I like him, even though.
Yeah, he did something, I can't remember what it is right now, but he did something almost, it seems to me in the book, at a certain point he comes close to being as pivotal and crucial as Shannon.
In some ways I feel he has a more human view of the science that they were both doing than Shannon does, that Shannon was in a way, and now I'm just talking about, personal taste. This opinion is worth nothing, but his work there's something a little bit cold about it. He didn't care that much, Shannon, about connecting it to, never asked himself, how's this going to help people? And I'm not saying that a scientist needs to do that, but, you can also kind of like a scientist who does, and Wiener did. Mm-hmm. Wiener was thinking, how's this going to affect the study of medicine?
For example.
For example, yeah.
Information.
Yeah, information. So I liked him too. It's a messy story.
No, well, it's very funny, the part where the subtlety with which they very quietly insult each other by complimenting each other is hilarious. I mean, they pay these compliments, but sort of slip in certain chronological facts that seem to make them more important, especially, I think, Wiener.
Yeah. I thought that was sort of juicy.
Those wonderful pages.
In a kind of polite way that you feel doesn't exist anymore, twisting the knife just in a very gentlemanly way.
You haven't, but
your
so
wife
is a literary reviewer, and we don't know about pull a little knife from time to time? I don't know.
Touche.
Have you had the knife twisted against you in your books by reviewers?
Well,
Has anyone?
no reviewer has ever criticized it. Or else those have been hidden from me.
No.
Yeah, no, what do you mean?
Well, I'm just curious as to whether since you're writing relentlessly in a field in which you are humanizing and making accessible somewhat abstract and intellectual matters of often mathematical nature, I'm wondering whether scientists or other science writers have ever done that Wiener Shannon
Oh, you
thing
mean
to
have
you.
there, as it? Yeah, sure.
Can you say?
Yeah, no, I'm not gonna. No, I mean, I should. At this point, I should say. I mean, I would like to say, but I won't insult you all. That I don't really read or pay attention to the reviews
Right.
and the negative reviews. When actually the truth is, I'm only telling you because I don't want to insult you, and because Dan would tell you that I remember every word of all the negative reviews. I don't remember the positive ones. And sure, I attribute personal motives to some of those reviewers, but
Right.
No.
Well, I'm just thinking it just.
but that's just me. They're
Yeah, so it goes. I mean, so it goes. This is the way. In fact, you and I asked you if you knew Tom Lehrer's songs, and you said that about Nikolai Ivanovich Lobachevsky is about a mathematical plagiarist. And if you all don't know who Tom Lehrer is, Google him, and you'll find his wonderful. He was a mathematician, right?
yeah, he was.
Yeah.
All right, I'll tell you one review story.
Okay.
Should I do that? This is from my first book, and it's
It was fine.
Chaos.
Chaos. Sorry.
And it's a review that appeared in England, and it said this book has a lot of there are a lot of scientists. There are too many scientists with American names like Feigenbaum, Mandelbrot. You see where I'm going.
Yeah.
And I
It is
thought
the-
there actually were scientists in my book named Ford, Farmer, and I, as an American, I think of those as the American names, but obviously this English reviewer was trying to say something else.
Well, there's a perduring anti-Semitism in England, even though the British don't know it. I mean, it sometimes comes bubbling up, as in this review. So the other way I read your book, other than a procession, which is not the main way, is a sort of penetration through what we think of as matter and substance to an increasingly sort of abstract, to say that reality, I think, is basically information. There's a progression of the thinkers themselves, and I think of your view of the development of information theory as leading to a sort of immaterial view of materiality. Is that right? Is that an okay way to say it?
I think that's very nicely put.
And it seems, it's almost as if the book itself begins to sort of not dissolve, but sort of subside, or not subside, but sort of penetrate down into the, I mean, the book itself reaches a sort of point of where what you think of as a solid wall, just as in atomic physics, begins to kind of dissipate. We think we know what a chair is, but a chair is information, and that's the kind of, I mean, there's a dissolution involved.
Yeah, but this is sort of the puzzle that I felt that I did wrestle with. And when I say wrestle, I mean I knew it was a problem, and all through the book I've tried to come to grips with it, Or you could say it's not a bug, it's a feature. I mean, I knew that it was
It
something
is a
that I
feature.
wanted to express, but that it was difficult to express. And this thing, I mean, you just put it very well. In the passage I read, I made reference to John Archibald Wheeler's "it from bit" idea, and Wheeler, who was a great physicist who just died a few years ago, was not any kind of crank, but he did have a way of talking about these things that sounds a little bit mystical, and you wonder how literally you're supposed to take it. Really, the bit is a fundamental particle out of which matter and energy can be made?
That's what it's.
Information is more at the core of things than matter and energy? I mean, are we supposed to take that literally? And honestly, I don't know, because because I'm not a scientist. I just write about. I just play one. You know.
Talk about that for a minute. Talk about that for a minute. You're not a scientist, but just before we began, you told me you were an English major, with some linguistics thrown in. How did you begin to know mathematics? The higher fairly high mathematics that you seem to know, or don't you?
I don't.
Ah.
I don't claim to know anything like higher mathematics.
How about middle mathematics? You seem to know. I mean, you know what that sign means, right? This
You know,
sign, look,
okay.
look, this sign. You know what that means, right?
Sort of. But I don't know any more about it than you do.
Oh, but I don't know anything about
Okay.
it.
Okay, now I'll say something that I've never said before. And this is something that's just popped into my head, and it's connected with the bad review question. I got another bad review once
Not that he thinks of them. Or,
by a mathematician, a professor of mathematics someplace. And it's the only bad review I've ever gotten where I thought, wow, this guy is onto me. Most of the bad reviews I've gotten have been unjustified and stupid. But this one, and he said things like, and this is actually a review of my short biography of Isaac Newton.
which is such a good book that I cannot express it.
Thank you.
I told Jim I told Jim how he wrote that book, and he told me that he paid me the greatest reader's compliment. He said that's how he meant it, and I think you said one other person got it that way, that you wrote it. He wrote it in a Newtonian way, in which I don't even know anything about Newton's. I know that something that's resting. I mean, I know that. Well, I know why this. I know why this fell. Although that's my Newtonian expertise. But I know style. I know tone when I see it, and I know Jim. I felt that Jim had written the Newton book in a kind of very solid, sort of almost Anglo-Saxon, blunt kind of way, a little Hilary Mantel-ish in certain ways. It had that sense of old-fashionedness and so on. And Jim then paid me the nice compliment and said that I had only one other person had read it that way. So in this case, it seems to me that well, I've already said
Well,
where I
I'd
think
rather
it
let
goes.
you go on in this vein for the rest
No,
of
no.
for the rest
But
of our
go
time.
back to
But
Newton.
here's somebody who saw something in the book that you didn't see, and that is, he said something like about. Now I had to deal with the problem of calculus because Newton invented it.
The calculus.
The calculus. And so I had to not just sort of explain what it is, but I also had to assume that many of my readers would already know what it was, but I also had to kind of be in Newton's head as he was figuring it out and things like that. And this reviewer said something to the effect of that while there's nothing actually wrong in what I wrote, you get the feeling that the author doesn't really understand any more about calculus than he is able to put on the page. That I don't really have a profound understanding of it. And that is absolutely true. I am struggling. I struggle as I write this stuff. And there are things in this book also, not many, because this book isn't very I want to sell the book now. There isn't too much science in it. But where there is science, I'm an amateur, and
How did you get from English?
I was a journalist. I still think of myself as a journalist. You know, I worked for the New York Times for 10 years. I was an editor on the city desk. When I was 30 years old, I would not have said that I was or could ever be a science writer. That was not the plan.
What?
But a journalist has the skill, or at least the mission, of asking people a lot of questions about what they do. So that's what I did.
And you became more and more interested in this particular.
Yeah, and I do think I have some aptitude for it. I was really good at math when I was a kid, and just turned away from it.
That's kind of burying the lead. I mean, that explains a lot, because I think most of us, especially the MFA students and teachers, were probably not so good at math. So.
Well, I don't know. I don't think we should.
I
don't think we should diss them. They might have been good at math.
I think that's a compliment that they weren't good at math. There's no diss.
Well, what I'm saying is you can be really good at math and not go in that direction.
Exhibit A.
And so the fact, and there are writers. Let's talk about this. There are fiction writers who some fiction writers are more interested in my kind of stuff than other fiction writers. But the ones who are, some of them are really smart about them. I'm thinking of Richard Powers, for example. Read Richard Powers?
Not one of my favorites.
Then, you know, drifting over towards science fiction, Neil Stephenson is obviously a very geeky kind of fiction writer. Drifting back towards people who can win Booker Prizes, Margaret Atwood. Now, I don't know if she thinks she's good at math or science, but I think she is. Okay.
So, do you feel? I mean, near the end of the book. I mean, the third process here. There's a parade of people. There's a sort of penetration of matter to the point where it kind of not evaporates, but evanesces into information, and that's another direction of the book. And another direction of the book is the third word in the subtitle, flood. That's another, I won't say agenda, because it's not like you're prosecuting a case, but it's another moving part of the book. And so now I have to ask you, do you think that we have too much information? Do you think that our minds, our human wetware minds, are somehow have been overmastered by what they have produced?
Yes and no.
Give me the yes.
Well, the yes is, well, duh. I mean, sorry, no.
Okay, I'll give you the no.
Well, no, I mean, we all of us are, so, as I said in the part I read, TMI is now a familiar acronym. When I started writing the book, TMI wasn't, by the way. I mean, that's how long it took me to write it. Only about 8 years ago, TMI stood for 3 Mile Island. Information anxiety, information flood. You can, look on Amazon and count the number of books devoted to this subject. It's obviously something that we are concerned about. Should we be concerned about it? Well, from one point of view, if we are, we should be. I mean, we're not idiots.
Well, right. I mean, if we are, is what you're saying. I mean, you can't say you shouldn't be concerned about too much information. That sentence, in a way, doesn't make any sense.
Right. You should be concerned about it. Now,
it's not that. It's that you are concerned about it.
You are concerned about it. Because...
And everybody.
And we are... now I'll say two more. I'll contradict myself very quickly again. I'll say this is a very old problem, and one of the sort of fun things for me in the book is finding older expressions of what we recognize as worry about information anxiety. Hobbes. Well, Hobbes, that was really interesting. But, and then Leibniz complained about the horrible mass of books that was flooding now Leibniz is 1700, 1710, or even earlier. How many books is he worried about? there just weren't that many, but he already thought there were too many. And it behooves us to understand why. Why did he see that as a problem? Well, because, and I'm guessing a little bit here, because he was a polymath, he was a great philosopher, he considered it his business to know everything, and it was getting to the point where he couldn't possibly know everything. He would think, there's too much specialization, there's genuine knowledge here that an educated person can't keep up with. And we hear that today. In 1920, you could hear physicists saying, for the first time in the history of physics, I picked the year 1920 at random. It's been true every year. It is true every year, and it's still true, that you can find people who will say, physics used to be a subject where a really great physicist would know the entire field, and now that's impossible because we've got, condensed matter physics, and we've got the Higgs boson, and I can't keep up with everything. It's just the same problem that we all face in. There isn't anybody in this room.
You don't think there's anything different about the concern now?
Yes, I do think there's something different about it. It's worse now than ever. It really is worse now because we are using Twitter. We are connected at light speed to people on the farthest, at the farthest places on the globe, because where we used to have to at least go to the library to get one of those of the horrible massive books. Now they are instantly accessible to us just by, reaching into our pockets. Music used to be something that we treasured because we had a finite collection, if we had any at all, of physical records, and
now it's common.
Listen to them over and over again. Now that you can listen to any piece of music you want at any moment, it changes our relationship with it, and it creates problems that I still struggle to come to grips with as somebody who likes to listen to music. What am I going to listen to now? Right. Why should that be a problem? Okay, and then to fight back against everything I've just said, why is that a problem? We are the lucky ones. You can't have too much of something that we value so much. Just
ice cream.
We're gonna
cupcake. No, seriously.
You can't have too much ice cream. You can eat too much ice cream, but you can't have too much access to ice cream. You just learn discipline.
You and I have argued sometimes about.
No.
Yes, we have. You and I have discussed from time to time the book The Shallows, Nicholas Carr, based on his Google Making Us Stupid, and his piece in the Atlantic.
We've argued about it even though only one of us has read it.
Right. That's the way we usually argue, I think. So there are these, speaking of too much information, there are these studies that have been done of giving people a text to read with no hyperlinks and giving another group of people a text to read with hyperlinks. And then there are retention questions, memory retention questions afterward. And always in these experiments, it seems that those who did the reading without hyperlinks retained more of the content of the text than those who had the hyperlinks. I believe even if they didn't click on the hyperlinks, but I'm not sure about that. So,
but were they happier? Seriously, were they better cooks? I mean, that kind of study.
So let me ask you.
My instant reaction to that kind of study is that it's flawed.
It's not flawed. I mean,
yeah, it's flawed. It's distorted. That in the design of the study, they're producing the answer they're looking for.
What if they were okay? Then let me try it another way. Let me try my question to you another way.
Okay, sorry.
I don't understand, both in this book and in our general conversations, not sure I know I mean, you just sort of said yes and no. I'm not sure whether I know how you emotionally feel about this flood, as you put it.
I feel a little bit differently from you, I think. Then that's why
We bicker.
that's not why we bicker, but that's why you framed it in terms of an argument between
Right.
us. That is, as soon as you, and we just saw it, as soon as you start to make the case for how the internet is making us stupid, I get my back up. As soon as you say kids today cannot become profound creative thinkers the way they could a generation ago because they're just being bombarded with too much stuff, or because stuff comes too easily to them. They don't have to work as hard for it.
They have to memorize.
They don't have to memorize. All right. I mean, there was a time when you had to memorize poetry
Yes.
as part of your education. I'm not old enough for that to have been part of my education. You
Right.
aren't either.
Yes, I am. I had to memorize poetry.
Okay, well, I didn't have to memorize poetry.
I thank you for the compliment.
And I think that's too bad. I should have been forced to memorize poetry, and there are a lot of other things like that. There are pieces of music that I know. I'm not a musician, just as a listener. Profoundly well, because there was a time in my life when I only had a couple of records and I listened to them again and again and again, and I could name them, and that will never happen to me anymore, because now I can get bored with them too quickly, or I might listen to them while I'm reading a magazine, or God forbid, surfing the internet. It's very easy to make that case that the superfluity of information, the ease of access to information is making us shallower. But I fundamentally don't believe it. I don't believe it.
Well, I do believe it, but I would say, and now I'm going to surprise you, so what? Even if you do believe it, so what? I mean, Gutenberg was 500, 600 years ago. Why aren't books an historical moment anyway? I mean, they're pretty new. And,
well, it depends what part of the case you're talking about.
Well, no, I'm just going...
There's some things, there's some great... Am I interrupting you too much?
No. I'm interviewing you.
There are some great...
So, supposedly.
things that people do, great creative accomplishments that we want them to continue to be able to do, write novels.
See, I mean...
You don't care.
It's not that I don't care, it's that I think that it's possible that the novel is also an historical moment. But I don't think stories, I don't think stories are an historical moment, because I think the way our brains are constructed makes it necessary for us to hear stories of various kinds. But I'm not sure that the novel as such, as a form, is some kind of permanent thing. I do think poetry is.
I hope that long-form fiction and nonfiction are here to stay. That even if the physical book goes away, I would be very sad to think of a world in which the novel was gone, or the kind of long books that I write. I mean, when I write a book, I think, as you know, we've argued about this too, I think the value of what I do is tiny compared to the value of a novel of the same length. But I think it has real value, because I feel that this isn't just a compendium of stuff, a book of this length, for me. It had to be that long, or I wouldn't have been able to say the things that I said. And so in whatever technology, information technologies prevail in the future, I hope that, and I believe, because I'm an optimist, that there's going to be room for this kind of thing, both fiction and nonfiction. I think the novel is a great invention, and it didn't exist until however many hundreds of years ago it came into existence. And now it's just great. I mean, it's my favorite thing, and I don't think it's over. I'm optimistic enough to think that there's going to continue to be both a market for it and the ability of people to create it. And by the ability, I include the attention span and the single-minded focus, the single-mindedness that's necessary, which is also necessary for great theoretical physics.
And you don't think that the interconnectedness of everything makes that more difficult for most people?
No.
Okay.
I think for some people, yes. I think, yes, there's a tension there, but I also think that it's balanced by, I mean, look how many writers there are now doing fiction, and a lot of them are actually really good. I don't think literary fiction is getting worse year by year. I actually think it's getting better. And I guess what I think, and this is sort of prejudice, this is entirely prejudice, not based on expertise. We have personality types, and some people are just able and willing to get obsessed with something and live with it for a very long time and tune out the distractions, and other people aren't. And the number of people who are that type, there's no reason to think there will be fewer of them. And I think that even in this complicated modern world, these people continue to find ways to focus obsessively on the things they care about.
I think, I don't know about time, Susie? Yeah. I mean, I actually wanted to ask you about the word information itself, because I think it means something now that is so different from its root that it makes me curious, but I'll ask you about it later.
Okay, no, let me ask you then, because the absolute truth of the matter is that you influenced me in the course of writing the book by making this point.
I kept looking for myself.
It's in there.
It is.
Yeah. I don't remember if I put you in the acknowledgments, but would you please explain what you mean by the root?
Okay. When information sort of lexically, if that's a word, means that if you get information, first of all, how about this? Belligerence informed the debate last night, okay? So that's an interesting way of using the word informed, and I always think, you make a distinction between or among wisdom, knowledge, information, right? There's a kind of tripartite thing, and you explain what each of them is. But I don't think that information means anything unless it informs a consciousness or a mind. That is to say, it's the tree falling in the woods paradox. That to be informed about something is to have part of yourself changed by what's coming into your being. And so the idea of just saying that a DNA string is information, well, only if it tells us something, tells us something. So if the universe were to be devoid of consciousness, you would say there's information in it, and I would say there's not. That's all.
That's good. And you said something like that to me
Yeah.
at some point, and it did help inform the final chapter where I tried to...
You did. I reread it. I'm
Okay.
glad
Okay.
I'm glad I informed
So now-
informed the book.
Now we've
Questions?
sickened them by patting ourselves on the back. So,
No, it's just so interesting. Yes.
So I assume you would take Plato and Pythagoras to be some of the earliest known proponents to this theory, or at least a prototype of this theory? Like
Well-
the Pythagorean, the Platonic forms,
not this theory necessarily. Pythagoras actually doesn't even have... precursors, yeah.
Well, Pythagoras believed that.
And Plato does make a couple of brief appearances in the book. Because he, and I guess this is true of Pythagoras too, I wanted to try to understand that part of human history too in kind of information theoretical terms. And by that part of human history, I mean the part where we were undergoing a transition from purely oral culture to literate culture. Plato was right there for it, and self-conscious of it, about it. And yet I feel, even though I'm no kind of classicist, I really, so I might be on flimsy ground for some of the assertions I make in this book. I really feel that to understand why Plato and Aristotle were focusing on the subjects they were focusing on, you need to remind yourself that they were, in their world, practically the first people to deal with ideas in writing. And when you write ideas down, as opposed to having a conversation about them, everything changes. You can look at them and reflect on them. History is born because the things you write down have a kind of permanence. Yeah.
Well, you can begin to identify them as two things: physical object and a word, concept.
Yes, and so the idea of the word becomes interesting. The idea of logical propositions comes into play. Aristotle can start to talk about the structure of a play or a story and say it has a beginning, middle, and an end. And so you think, well, of course it has a beginning, middle, and an end. Why is he bothering to tell us that? Well, that's why he's bothering to tell us that, because you need to define the terms.
Yes.
I want to thank you for Chaos. I've bought my copy. I've owned it since 1987. For me, it was a game changer, and I think I had to share this with so many people. I think I must have given away 150 copies by now.
Thank you. I'll write you a check.
Everybody said, have you read? And they say no, and I said, you're getting one next week. So it really transformed my understanding of the world. I thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Wow. Not
Okay.
a question, but yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
I have a question. I apologize in advance for not reading the information, but we'll get it. About the Google guys, and I think this is a relevant question for the room as well. Early on, the two guys, who created Google, set out to scan and to save all the books, every book. And there was an outcry from publishers for obvious reasons. Here are two guys basically going to control all the world's knowledge, and what are they going to do with it, and how are they going to monetize it? And I'm curious, based on all the writings you've done on scientists, whether you believe that the impulse is more of a scientific impulse on their part, maybe it turned into something else, but almost like a cartographer's impulse to map the world. That these guys, their whole thesis was about getting information and collecting it and making it into something that could be usable. And it just seems like a logical extension that the next big step would, if you gave me $1 billion, that's what I'd want to do. I'd want to take all the world's knowledge and kind of collect it all together, so that when the apocalypse comes and everybody burns the books, at least it's in a Google storage somewhere, protected. Anyway, so my question is, do you think that there's a scientific impulse?
Okay.
And then maybe the second part of that is, what do you think about their place in this story?
Everybody could hear that, right? I don't have to repeat. Okay. I actually will say something about that. First of all, I have a disclaimer. I've actually been involved in the case against Google from the point of view of authors, because I have a relationship with the Authors Guild, and the Authors Guild sued Google over this very thing. So I could say, from that point of view, I could answer your question by just talking about the self-interested reasons they were doing it, which I think are entirely real. I mean, where I'm going to end up in answering this question is say, I don't know, because I'm not a mind reader. And then I'm going to say, yes, you can look at it both ways. You can say it was a business thing to do. They want to make a lot of money. Google is a profit-making enterprise. They scanned a lot of books for purposes of making a lot of money. Eventually. Well, they're making a lot of money very quickly, and having those books improve the quality of their search engine is a big part of it. But I also have a lot of sympathy with the spirit of your question, because I've thought about it that way sometimes myself, that it seems like if you think of Google in the most high-minded possible way, as an enterprise, the way that they themselves, the Google guys, have described their own motivations, as an enterprise devoted to helping organize the world's knowledge, then yes, of course they would want all the books, and of course they would send their little cars driving up and down the street, taking pictures of intersections and
houses.
people sunbathing in their front yards.
Yes.
You know, I guess I don't want to say whether personally I think their motives, whether they're saints or sinners. I think
But
there's
look
an
at the
element of
difference
both.
between Google and Wikipedia, which you deal with extensively here, and I think is an interesting
Well,
comparison.
that's a good point. There is a difference. Google is a profit-making company. Wikipedia
Is not.
alone, of all of the great internet enterprises, isn't. And so with Wikipedia, you can actually justify the view that their motives are fairly pure.
And-
Especially because when you say they, you're talking about a very amorphous group of people,
Yeah.
right?
Doesn't someone monkey with your Wikipedia entry sometimes?
Mine?
Yeah,
Because I told you that?
yeah.
It has happened, yeah.
Can you tell us, can you remind me what it is?
No, I'm not going to, I don't think I'll say that, but...
Okay, there's an imp who goes into
No, that
Jim's-
just happened once.
There
and it's
was
certainly
an
not
imp
more
who
me
went into
than...
his Wikipedia entry and did something very funny.
Oh, that's right.
It's all public. It's not interesting, but one of the great things about Wikipedia is, for some reason, I'm much more interested in selling Wikipedia than Google. It's all public. The entire history. Do you know this, right? The entire history of all the editing that's been done on every Wikipedia article is there for you to see, with the IP addresses, if not the identities of the editors.
One more? Yeah, in the back?
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Two more.
From gathering all this research for science writing, you say you don't come from a big science background, and so higher math, calculus, things like that, it's difficult to fully wrap your mind around some of the concepts or the further math of it. How do you end up where do you start with all that research and then transferring that research onto the page to write your novels, your books?
As I go along, basically. I've never been able to, I don't know if you're supposed to do this, but I've never been the kind of writer who does the research, has it all assembled, and then writes. I always do it as I go along. And of course, most of the research is front-loaded, as we would say, but as I get a head start. But by the time I'm up to the chapter on entropy,
Boy, that's...
I'm writing it, and the writing guides the direction of the research. And sometimes I don't know what I need to look up next until I'm writing it, and then I realize, oh, this is what I don't know. This is the next part of the story, and I need to find out about it now.
Last one?
Yes.
Is that, Susie, is that about right?
Yeah, that'd
No, okay.
be good. So one is, you said you are a linguist, but
No,
I thought you said
no,
that-
he
No.
said that I majored in linguistics.
I only said it because he said it. No, I didn't say you majored. I said you majored in English with a dabble in linguistics.
Yeah, that's true.
Because I would think linguistics would be a math connection.
Oh, is that okay?
Yeah, I would too.
Yes, I think that's true. I think actually that's why I'd started off majoring in linguistics. This is so not important. Turn off the tape.
No.
I started off majoring in linguistics and then discovered, first of all, that I didn't know any foreign languages. And second, and there was a more serious reason that turned out not to be the right major for me. But I think yes, you're right. That's why it was interesting, because the study of language in itself is
It's math.
it's partly math, but it's even more fundamentally than math. It's about information
And the second,
and encoding.
sorry, the second part of that is, one of the things that I'm sort of fixated on is the division between the math science mind and the English social studies mind, especially in the secondary ed. And it seems to me that in the math science realm, there's sort of a pride in keeping that language separate. So one of the things I've been working on is having those kids be more open to metaphor And have you done anything with that concept, especially, I know that MIT now does a very heavy emphasis on incorporating liberal arts into the education in terms of things like literature. We know Chomsky there and so forth. Have you done anything with introducing more of metaphor into the realm of math and science? I mean, you're doing that through your book, but on a more universal scale.
That's a very difficult and sort of big question in a way. I mean, we could talk about that for a long time, as Dan knows. First of all, I use metaphor. Metaphor is one of, if you're writing about science but you're not a scientist and you're trying to explain things that are written in the language of mathematics to non-mathematicians, metaphor is, that's what, that's your palette. Yeah. Second, maybe that's cheating. That is, the real thing, you can take the view, I think this is what you're saying, is that some mathematicians take the view that the real thing is over here in the language of mathematics, and the metaphor is automatically a cheat because it's not the real thing. It loses something. It's only an approximation. It's, it's the Cliff Notes. In fact, that's not what I think. What I think is that there is no firm boundary between these two worlds, and that even these people, the purest of pure theorists, use metaphor because we are humans and that's how our minds work. And even if they aren't comparing their numbers to pictures or to animals, they are thinking in terms of analogy. I believe in science there are a lot of people who are more comfortable thinking in those ways than others. A person who leaps to mind is Douglas Hofstadter, who was an early influence on me, whose first book was Gödel, Escher, Bach. And Hofstadter is a computer scientist and the son of a theoretical physicist at Caltech, Robert Hofstadter, forget what his father's name was. But core to Hofstadter's thinking is some idea about the way we use analogy we humans in both scientific and non-scientific thought. Hofstadter has told me a story. I guess I'm going to end with this as the answer to your question. That he once he told me the story when I was working on my biography of Feynman, who was a great explainer of science. Yeah. He was invited to the Caltech Physics Colloquium, which was a big Caltech institution that involved all the physicists, and Feynman would sit in the front row in a very specific place, and Murray Gell-Mann would sit in the front row in another place. And Hofstadter gave his presentation about analogy in scientific thinking, and he said at the end of it, Feynman eviscerated him, was nasty and mean, and tore him to shreds, and he's never forgotten it, and kind of never.
I'm amazed.
And yeah, I was amazed too, because I like Feynman and I like Hofstadter, and I would have thought that Feynman would be understanding, but Feynman.
But he was such a good explainer.
He was a good explainer, and he certainly used metaphor. But I think he had the kind of attitude that you're referring to, that there is a kind of purity about science that can be corrupted if you just talk about it in terms of analogy. Anyway, there was a disconnect there. And I think that disconnect is alive and well, and I think it's too bad.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for asking such good questions. Thank you.